Hello everybody and welcome to another One Piece chapter review for this 4th of July weekend, this time for chapter 1018. Pretty good fight chapter, Jinbei vs. Husu, and we also get to expand on some of the lore of the One Piece verse. We start off with one of my favorite cover pages that we've had in a while. Ultien page 1 in a dinosaur playroom surrounded by stuffed animals, and each of the toys is representing Kaido as well as his top officers from the Calamities and the Topiropo. I'm assuming the one in the middle is supposed to be an Allosaurus, so it's representing Drake, and I believe this is the first time where we see page 1's full hairstyle, like half-shaved head. Apparently the person who requested the cover page wanted Ultien page 1 to be drawn as children, but Oda drew them as adults, and I think the reason for that is because he's saving the Topiropo kid designs for a future SBS. Over the week we also got some pretty cool info because of the Vivre card packs that came out, so it was just revealed that Roger's sword was named Ace. Normally you would think a father would name his sword after his son, but no, in this case Roger named his son after his sword. And Ace was one of the Saiho o Wazamono, one of the 12 supreme great swords. So now we can add it to the list here, which means that we currently know 4 of the 12 Saiho o Wazamono swords. And what I think is interesting here is that even though Roger and Whitebeard had a Saiho o Wazamono each, neither of them ended up turning their blades black. So it could mean that maybe forging a black blade is a feat that is reserved for people that specialize in swordsmanship. People that live and breathe the way of the sword. It's a way of life for them. You know, swordsmanship is their vocation. Characters like Vista, Ryuma, Mihawk, and Zoro. And speaking of Zoro, even though technically he doesn't have one of the 12 Saiho o Wazamono, he doesn't have a supreme great sword, it may not actually matter because according to Hitetsu, if he turns Enma black, then Enma's rank will increase. So Zoro could turn Enma into a Saiho o Wazamono, into a supreme great sword. And if that's how that works, then it would also make sense that if he could turn Wado Ichimonji into a black blade, then Wado Ichimonji would also become a Saiho o Wazamono by the end of the series, meaning that instead of having 12 supreme great swords, we would have 14, or maybe even 15, because if Zoro gets the Nidai Kitetsu by the end of Wano, he can up the rank of the Nidai Kitetsu by turning it black, and then maybe Zoro will have 3 supreme great swords by the end of the series. And so of course this also brings up questions about Shusui and Yoru's original rank, right? Like, did Mihawk and Ryuma do the exact same thing that we know Zoro's gonna end up doing, which is taking a sword of a lower rank, turning it black, and therefore raising the rank of the sword? Like, before Yoru became a black blade, was it still a supreme great sword, or did it become a supreme great sword because Mihawk made it black? Because I think Roger and Whitebeard's swords, those were always part of the top 12 worldwide. And speaking of blades, since we know that Weevil's weapon is different than Whitebeard's because it has a different design, kinda curious if this is also a Saiho o Wazamono. Another thing we learned during the week was Marco's bounty, finally. So we knew from chapter 1014 that Luffy had the highest bounty on the side of the Alliance, which meant that Marco's bounty had to be under 1.5 billion. And so now we know that Marco's confirmed bounty is a total of 1.374 billion. Which, in terms of known bounties, puts him under Luffy, but it also puts him over characters like Katakuri and Queen. Now, Marco being over Katakuri makes perfect sense to me. You have to think about it from a notoriety standpoint, because we know that Whitebeard was the strongest man in the world. So, from that standpoint, Whitebeard was more notorious than Big Mom. So when you compare the bounties on their first YCs, it makes perfect sense why Marco wins over Katakuri due to being affiliated with Whitebeard. And so the real question for me is, okay, how much is King gonna be worth then? Because Kaido currently holds the title of the strongest creature and the strongest pirate. He's been referred to as both of those things. So is King's bounty gonna be under Marco's? Is it gonna be above Marco's? Honestly, I would want their bounties to be equal. I would want them to have the exact same amount. However, it wouldn't surprise me if Oda wants to hype King up, and so he ends up giving King a higher bounty than Marco. That wouldn't surprise me at all. But again, I would like it if they were the same, because they're technically the first YCs of the 2 strongest pirates. By the way, Queen's bounty being as high as it is might have something to do with the fact that the government knows that he was at one point affiliated with Vegapunk. Now back in chapter 1016, we learned that the numbers for the armies stood like this, but now because of 2,000 casualties plus 2,000 players changing sides, which include 300 gifters, the numbers currently stand like this.
And so obviously we'll see these numbers change again, because even according to ZP0, the gifters will be taking down some fodder on the Beast Pirate side.
And so we get to see all of that unfold, and we also get to see a pretty glaringly obvious contradiction, because on one side we have Nami telling Zeus that he is not her servant. Because if Zeus were to be her servant, then that would go against Zeus's freedom. But then on the other hand, we have Tama using her Devil Fruit ability to control the minds of the gifters, to make them do things that they normally wouldn't do. So I just thought those were two contradicting ideas within the same scene. Now before the scene cuts to ZP0, I think we get to see Batman again in one of the lower panels.
And then ZP0 has this comment about how the real reason they're there in the first place is to make sure that Who's Who dies. And so when I heard that comment, I was like, wait, do we know any of these people? Do we know any of these agents? Like if they were to remove their masks, would we see some familiar faces? Now there's another comment made within that same scene when one of the other CP0 members says, have you confirmed that it's actually him? In other words, can we confirm his identity? And so that comment kind of makes me think that Who's Who isn't really KO'd by the end of this, because in order for ZP0 to confirm that it's actually Who's Who, we have to be able to see his face first, right? So either he has to take off his mask or his mask has to shatter. Maybe it did shatter by the end of this chapter, but the point of the matter is that we have to be able to see Who's Who's face before this is all said and done. That, and plus if he's an awakened Zoan, then he should be able to get back up. Then again, in the official translation, when we cut to the fight, we do get to see one of Who's Who's crew members saying that Who's Who is going all out. So maybe there is that possibility that he did get KO'd by the end of this. Now for the sake of organization, I'm going to talk about the fight between Who's Who and Jinbei first, and then after that I'll talk about the lore of the Sun Warrior. I just think that would suit the structure of this video better.
The fight resumes with Who's Who using Geppo to get some elevation over Jinbei. Then he sends down another Fang pistol, but Jinbei blocks it using armament hockey, except it actually cuts him. It kind of reminds me of the way Cracker was able to cut Luffy while he was in Gear 4th. And then WW just starts spamming these Fang pistols down at Jinbei. Fortunately for him, he's fast enough to move out of the way using his own variation of Soru. He just kind of phases out of that attack. But the rain of bites actually goes through the floor and starts hitting people on the 3rd floor, which by the way, the 3rd floor is where Robin and Brooke are currently fighting Black Maria, so hopefully those bites don't affect them. And then Who's Who congratulates Jinbei for being smart enough to dodge the attack, but then he also uses that as a way of making a discriminatory remark about fishmen being able to move fast on land. And then what's crazy is that he uses Tekai after that, but the thing here is that Tekai, or Iron Body, is being used synonymously with armament hockey, because his fangs, when he says Tekai, his fangs get coated in hockey. He's literally using the word Tekai as a synonym for armament hockey in that scene. So it's one of 3 options. It's either the Rokishi techniques were inspired by hockey, that's one. Number 2 is that maybe CP9 agents were actually using hockey back then, which I don't believe, but it is a possibility. And number 3, which I think is the most likely option, is that since at the time of Enies Lobby, Oda didn't really have the hockey system fully developed, he just said, I'm going to give these CP9 agents some cool techniques that they can use. And then later, once the story started nearing the end of the pre-time skip, he actually started brainstorming ideas on how to develop a more specific hockey system. And he just thought about CP9 and the Rokishi techniques. And he was like, well, I guess I could use some of those techniques as inspiration for this new hockey system that I'm trying to develop. Now, as we learned back in Enies Lobby, you can use Iron Body, you can use Tekai for attack purposes. It's not just a defense thing. You can use it to attack as well. Anyway, Who's Who pounces on Jinbei with his armament hockey fangs. Jinbei blocks the attack and grabs the fangs with armament hockey of his own and uses a Jujutsu shoulder throw similar to the one he used on Big Mom to roll her away back when they were on the live stage. Slams WW into the ground. He's actually bleeding out of the mouth. Jinbei then goes for the water shots, and despite being upside down, Who's Who actually uses Soru to speed himself out of there and avoid the attack. The fight continues with Who's Who using Shigan with armament hockey to be able to perform Madara. The attack is called Spots in English, and it's the same attack that Rob Lucci used against Luffy near the end of their fight. Jinbei starts coating his face with hockey, and I really wanted to get a better shot of him in that moment because I'm very curious if he can actually go full body armament hockey, and we just didn't get to see it, or if he actually is just coating like his arms and his face. We see some black lightning coming out of him, and this is where it gets kind of confusing, folks, because Who's Who's finger actually bends the wrong way. And you can see in that panel
panel that he's not actually touching Jinbei. I'm guessing this is just Jinbei's Ryo, because he was using basic armament Haki before, and Who's fingers were fine. But then he ups it up a notch, and he creates this barrier around him. So I'm guessing that's Ryo, that's armament Haki still. But it gets kind of confusing. Like, it reminded me a little bit of Zoro using Ashura, where you don't know where his King's Haki starts and his armament Haki ends. So there's like a very thin line between those two sometimes, and it gets kind of confusing. But yeah, Jinbei forces Who to fall back using his Haki barrier, and as the cat falls back, Jinbei takes this as an opportunity to grab him by the wrists and shatter them for him using a move called Shark Grip. WW withstands the pain, however, sends down a Rankyaku onto Jinbei's face. Jinbei pretty much tanks the slash, and then he gets hit with a close-range Fang pistol to the face, and he eats that up as well. What an absolute monster Jinbei is. He pulls a reverse Rob Lucci by stepping on his opponent's tail so that they can't move, and finishes it off with Rokyogan!
Okay, so it's not really Rokyogan, but the impact of Demon Brick Fist felt similar. It kind of read the same way in my mind. See, this is what happens when you underestimate Jinbei. That's why the CP0 agent was gassing him up when he said, I don't know if Who will survive. He is fighting Jinbei after all. Things we know about Jinbei is that he forced Ace to a standstill. We know that back in the day, after Fisher Tiger died, he became the captain of the Sun Pirates. And he literally says that after he became captain, he fought every day. It was the school of hard knocks for Jinbei. At one point, he fought against Strawberry as well, beat the crap out of him. Strawberry reported back to Kizaru, and Kizaru was all like, oh, Strawberry fodder. And then again, this chapter pretty much confirms that Jinbei has some type of advanced armament Haki. In the official translation, Who says, you made the right decision to dodge. Your typical armament Haki won't stop these fangs from tearing you apart. So he's saying that basic armament Haki won't be enough to protect Jinbei, and then by the end we see Jinbei clearly tanking the fangs. So he probably is using the Ryo barrier to protect against those fangs by the end. So as things are now, Luffy, Zoro, and Jinbei are the only ones in the crew that have shown advanced versions of armament Haki. So we're just kind of waiting on Sanji or maybe some of the other Straw Hats to show something similar. One last thing here, there was a chapter that came out a while ago that ended with Kaido hitting Kinemon over the head. And I got some comments saying that, like, if you look at Kaido's club in that panel, you'll see a white crack on the club. And so people were saying, Luffy cracked Kaido's club. And so if you look at the end of this chapter, you see that when Jinbei is punching Who's Who, you see kind of like the same white line effect on Jinbei's impact wave. And so I think it's more about like a stylistic choice from Oda. I don't think Luffy cracked Kaido's club yet. I think he will, or he will do something to it in the future. But that scene, I don't think it was a crack on the club. I just think it was the white line effect that we also see by the end of this chapter with Jinbei's attack. So now we get to talk about the Sun God Warrior. Who are they? I feel like the default answer here is that it's Luffy. If you look at the silhouette, you see that the figure's limbs seem to be made out of rubber because they don't bend like a normal human being's limbs would bend. However, I feel like there's already enough talk about Luffy being the next Joy Boy. So for him to be this other legendary figure as well would seem like very uninteresting to me, and it would seem like, oh, that's way too much. Like, how many titles is Luffy gonna have? So if it does turn out to be Luffy, I guess I'll just come to accept it when it does happen. But in the meantime, I want to have a little bit more fun with it. So I'm just going to be giving you some points / arguments that led me to another conclusion.
So my first thought was this. We know that Jinbei is the helmsman of the crew. And we know that he inherited Fisher Tiger's dream of being able to liberate the fishmen so that they could live in a world without discrimination. So the end game is pretty clear. It's for humans and fishmen alike to be able to live under the sun. Now the silhouette in the chapter originally reminded me a lot of Kalgura, and there is evidence that points to the Shandians believing in a sun god. However, it turned out to be that God of the Sun was just one of many epithets that the Shandians had for the great Kashigami, which was a giant snake that the Shandians worshipped. Also, Who's Who mentions in the chapter that the belief about this sun warrior god came from slaves, and as far as we know, the Shandians were not slaves. And we've actually seen the sun symbol, not just in Skypiea, and not just with the fishmen, but in Alabasta as well. And so of course we know that the Nefertari family was the only family that decided to move away from Marijoa.
Now, we already knew about the Fishman's sun tattoo ever since Arlong Park. You can see it there. And chronologically, we know that the Arlong Park arc happens before the Alabasta arc. Now, what I'm about to show you is the symbol of the Alabasta flag. So, like, here's a picture of it, you know. That's the Alabasta flag. Now, as I was doing the research, something that caught my attention was that unless you know what you're looking for during the Alabasta arc, especially during the anime, you might not even notice the symbol at all. It's very hidden. It's a secret symbol almost. It almost feels like Oda and the anime staff were very intentional about not bringing too much attention to it. Like even the shot of Sanji's jacket, which I just showed you a moment ago, is on the side, like it's never really facing the front. So you wouldn't really pay attention to the sun symbol unless you know what you were looking for. Same thing in Skypiea, which comes after Alabasta, right? It's there, the symbol is there, but it's not really in full view. So if you look at the carpet here, you'll see the sun symbol on the floor, and then you can see it on the floor on the following page as well. So it's kind of obvious that Oda wanted to foreshadow the symbol, but he didn't want to foreshadow it too much to the point where people would start making connections about what it could mean, right? Going like, wait a minute, haven't we seen that symbol before in Arlong Park, in Alabasta, in Skypiea? And then of course in Wano, we get a very similar symbol, which is the symbol for the Kozuki clan. Now I know a lot of people think that the orb or the celestial body depicted in the symbol could be the moon, or maybe it's the Earth surrounded by several moons or satellites. But regardless whether it's a planet or a natural satellite or a star, the point still remains is that it's a celestial body, right? It's like this orb that you would see floating in space. And so since we're seeing this symbol repeatedly, right, throughout different kingdoms, within some of the major kingdoms, right, we have to think about it as, okay, what do the fishmen, what do the people of Alabasta, what do the Skypieans, and what do the people of Wano have in common? Well, all of these people, to some extent, you know, to a certain degree, have either isolated themselves or have actually wanted to put some distance between themselves and the world government.
So the sun symbol stands for freedom. It stands in direct opposition to the will of the world government. Not only that, but get this, during Whole Cake Island, we learned via Big Mom's flashback that the kingdom of Elbaf actually practices 12 days of fasting before the Winter Solstice Festival. And you know what the Winter Solstice Festival is about? It's about celebrating the death and resurrection of the sun. So it turns out the sun is also worshipped and seen as a symbol in the kingdom of Elbaf. So by the end, I definitely foresee all of the major kingdoms where we've seen that sun symbol coming together under one flag to declare war against Imu and the Gorosei. The sun will be the thing that unites them all. Also, according to what Who's Who says, it is now pretty obvious that he was being kept in Marijoa. Back in the Reverie, we saw how they used slaves for labor in pretty bad conditions. And then we also know that Fisher Tiger was caught by the Celestial Dragons at one point and became a slave in Marijoa and was able to escape 16 years ago. And then he went back a year later and he set Marijoa on fire and was able to free some of the other slaves there. Now, Fisher Tiger freeing the slaves happened before Who's Who was imprisoned for the Devil Fruit incident. So Who's Who wasn't there at the time. And the way Who's Who expresses himself about his time there sounds really traumatic. So it just reminds me a lot of the way that Boa Hancock expressed herself when she was talking about her experience. But the point that I'm trying to make is that there are still slaves currently being kept in Marijoa, which means that they're still waiting on this legendary sun god warrior to show up and save them. And so the question that came to mind was like, okay, why is Who's Who talking about this with Jinbei specifically? Like, why is Oda giving us this exposition through Jinbei in the first place? And I think it goes back to Jinbei being the helmsman. During the final war, Jinbei is going to be in charge of the Sunny. And I know some of you might say, wait a minute, shouldn't Frankie be the one in charge of the Sunny? And I would say, say no, because I think that by the final war, Frankie's going to be very busy with Pluton-related stuff. I think it's very obvious that he memorized Pluton's blueprints for a reason. There's this whole theme to Frankie's backstory about how the things you build, they're not good or bad, it just depends on how you use them. So Frankie rebuilding Pluton is going to have a higher and bigger purpose than it just being a weapon of destruction. The point is that he's going to be busy, so Jinbei will be the one responsible for the Sunny. And if the Straw Hats are going to Marijoa to blow up the Red Line to confront Imu and the Gorosei, then it would be very fitting for Jinbei to follow in his previous captain's steps and be the one to free the slaves that are being held in Marijoa. In case you couldn't tell, the main point that I'm trying to get across here is that this legendary sun god warrior could be the physical manifestation of the Sunny Ghost spirit. We know the Going Merry spirit manifested itself as the Klabautermann. It first showed up in Skypiea after like a fire dance. But yeah, Frankie says that the Merry cared so deeply about the Straw Hats that it took on a human form to offer support. And so if that's what happened with Merry, given that we know that the material that the Sunny is made out of is very resilient and special, Sunny's made out of atom wood, which comes from a place that was described as being a war zone. So the question is, could the legendary warrior Nika be a manifestation of the Sunny Ghost spirit?
I thought it was so cool how this manga chapter happened to coincide with yesterday's anime episode, because the entire episode was sort of dedicated to Jinbei. The episode was kind of designed to hype Jinbei up as this extraordinary helmsman. In fact, this is what Frankie says about Jinbei in the episode. So could the reason for why Jinbei is learning about this legendary warrior now, could it be that maybe he's learning about it so that he can identify the warrior when he shows up? Because the thing about the Going Merry spirit is that when it first showed up in the series, like a part of me was like, what is this? Where did this even come from? It just kind of felt like it came out of nowhere initially, and then Frankie explained it to Usopp. But like in this case, like if this is the Sunny spirit, Oda is already foreshadowing this legendary hero or this legendary person appearing, and so it wouldn't come out of nowhere. So is it possible that this might be setting up Jinbei meeting this divine figure near the end of the series, and that Jinbei will be using the Sunny to free the slaves and take them out of Marijoa? Now, it's also been said that people who eat devil fruits, according to rumor, also have like a demon inside of them. So I also kind of thought, like, what if this spirit, what if this silhouette figure is actually supposed to represent the spirit of the Gomu Gomu no Mi? But then I ended up doing a lot more research on Nike, and what I found is that the evidence kind of supports this figure being more related to either Jinbei or the Sunny than it being related to Luffy. So this is what I found. Nike, which is the name that the figure's name is based off of, Nike was the goddess of victory in Greek mythology. One of the most famous statues, one of the most famous depictions of this goddess is actually in the Museum of Louvre in Paris. It's like this headless angel, and there's also another very famous statue of it, another very famous representation of the goddess Nike. And that statue is called the Nike of Callimachus, or the Victory of Callimachus. And that statue is actually referencing a battle that took place in 490 BC that is called the Battle of Marathon. Basically what happens during that battle is that it's an invasion of the Persians on Greece. So the Persians decide to send in some troops to invade this section on the coast of Greece. Now, as the Persian invasion moves forward, as the Persian troops advance, they basically enslave everybody that they capture. Now, at the end of the day, the Greeks are able to devise a strategy to push back the Persians, and so the Greeks end up actually winning that battle, and so the slaves end up being freed, and one of the major figures within that battle was called Callimachus. He was a commander. Unfortunately, Callimachus dies during the battle, and so that's why he has a statue dedicated to his victory. That's why it's called the Nike of Callimachus. But again, the relevance of that battle for the purposes of this chapter is that people were being enslaved during that battle and that they were freed after it. So Nike showed up, the Greeks obtained victory in the Battle of Marathon, and the thing about that statue, the Nike of Callimachus, is that it's actually broken. The statue is fragmented into pieces. And so there's been reconstructions about what the statue might have actually looked like when it was whole, and the pose of those images is the exact same pose that we see the silhouette figure have in this chapter. In addition, in a lot of Greek architecture and a lot of Greek artistry, Nike, the goddess Nike, is usually depicted as a charioteer. She's the one in charge of driving a chariot, right? She's the driver, which relates to Jinbei because he's basically the driver of the Sunny. In fact, there are several pieces of art with Nike, and she's actually driving the chariot that belongs to Zeus. So you see Nike being the driver of Zeus, right? Which is essentially what Jinbei is to Luffy. So just to summarize, Nike in Greek mythology plays a role in freeing slaves, and she also plays a role as a driver. Also in this chapter, Who's Who confirms his grudge against Shanks and his resentment against Luffy for getting the Straw Hat from Shanks and also getting the Devil Fruit power from Shanks. So if we take those two things into consideration and look at the chapter as a whole, I think what Oda is saying with this chapter is that, okay, we know that there's something going on with the hat. We know there's something special about it. We don't know what it is. We also know there's something special about the Gomu Gomu no Mi. There's something special about Luffy's Devil Fruit power. And so now if we follow that logic and add in this Sun God warrior, it could be that it's something special about the hat, something special about the Devil Fruit, and then there's also something special about the ship, which we already kind of knew because it's made out of atom wood. But this would kind of add like an extra layer to the Sunny being special. Also, I kind of want to know who the guard was that told Who's Who about Nika. Was it a random person, or was it perhaps an infiltrated revolutionary? We know that the revolutionaries have been able to infiltrate Marijoa, as we saw with Sabo and his group. And Sabo was able to infiltrate Marijoa by posing as a guard. So again, it's like, what's going on there, Oda? Was the guard who told Who's Who about Nika secretly a revolutionary? Now, by the end of the chapter, there's this moment where Who's Who notices that Jinbei is really getting upset. He's really angry. And I think the thing or the comment that upsets Jinbei is when Who's Who tells him, what is the history of fishmen if not the history of slavery? He's using them as synonyms, basically. And so it's like, wait a minute, like you're talking about a group of people. You know, that group of people, they have a culture, they have traditions, they have values, right? And so it seems like a very hasty generalization to say, oh yeah, like it's the same thing, fishmen and slaves. In other words, just because slavery is a part of the fishman history doesn't mean that it's the only part of fishman history. So I think that's the comment that really angers Jinbei and kind of motivates him to pull out that finisher. Also, just the whole talk about history, in my mind, kind of connects Jinbei to Robin, because Robin is the history buff of the crew. And recently in an SBS, Oda revealed that if the Straw Hats were a family, now with Jinbei as part of the crew, Robin would be the mom figure and Jinbei would be the dad figure. Finally, during the week, after we found out about Marco's bounty and the name of Roger's sword, I read this tweet from Sandman, basically reminding us about how Teach named his ship after Sebek. And in relation to what I was talking about with the Sunny, it just reminded me of how Teach kind of wants his ship to be special. And so Teach has this tendency to want to force things, right? Like if he didn't get the Yami Yami no Mi, he actually ends up killing somebody to get it. He names his ship after somebody who's legendary. Whereas when it comes to Luffy, he eats the Gomu Gomu no Mi, which is a special fruit, by accident. And then it turns out that the Sunny, right, the ship that he has, might actually be connected to a legendary figure as well, right? But it's not really intentional. That's not something that Luffy set out to do. Whereas Teach is really tactical and he likes to plan things. I mean, technically it's already planned out and it's already predetermined inside Oda's mind because it's a story, but you get what I'm saying. I thought the chapter was great. Great one to go on a break on. You got action and you have lore. There's not too much else I could ask for when it comes to a One Piece chapter. So great chapter. I really tried to dive in deep for this one, so I hope you appreciated the effort. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and for the support that you show my videos on a regular basis. Take care. Have a great 4th of July. If you don't celebrate it, have a great day anyway, and I will catch you guys later. Bye.